I work the overnight shift at a 24-hour grocery store on the edge of a small Ohio city, and for the first 6 months, I didn't notice it. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the moment itself, but the fact that I walked through it, again and again, without ever feeling it. Whatever it is, it lets you ignore it for a long time. And then one night, you don't. And after that, you can't. I want to tell this slowly, the way it actually happened, because the thing about the moment each night when no one moves is that it doesn't announce itself. It isn't a scream or a flicker of the lights. It's the opposite. It's a softness. It's the kind of thing that, if you weren't paying attention, you'd mistake for peace. My name doesn't matter much for this. Call me Wes. I took the job in the spring, after I'd been let go from a warehouse out by the interstate. I needed something with a steady paycheck and not too many people, and the grocery store on Linden was hiring overnight stalkers. The interview took 15 minutes. The manager, a tired man named Doyle with a coffee stain on his collar, asked me 3 questions and shook my hand. He said the overnight crew was small. He said most people didn't last. He said if I could show up on time and keep to myself, the job was mine. I said yes before he finished talking. The store was one of those mid-sized chain places with sliding glass doors and a row of cracked red carts under a metal awning. The parking lot stretched out in front like a dry lake, lit by tall sodium lamps that buzzed when the wind was low. Behind the building was a loading dock, a dumpster cage, and a strip of dead grass that ran up to a chain-link fence. Past the fence, just trees. The kind of trees that don't really lead anywhere, just thicken into themselves and forget the road exists. The overnight shift ran from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. There were 4 of us, usually. Me, on grocery. A woman named Camille, who handled dairy and frozen. A quiet older man named Russell, who did produce and bakery prep. And up front, behind the only open register, a cashier named Lynn, who also watched the doors. That was it. 4 people in a building the size of a small airplane hangar, surrounded by aisles of cereal and laundry detergent and bagged ice, while the rest of the city slept. I want to describe the store the way it lived in my head, because the geography matters later. When you walked in through the sliding doors, you hit a small entry vestibule with 2 gumball machines and a corkboard full of yellowed flyers. Past that, the registers ran along the front wall, 6 of them, only 1 ever lit. To the left was customer service, dark and gated after 10. To the right, the floral department, which always smelled like wet cardboard and cold water no matter what the season was. The aisles ran in long parallel rows back to a far wall lined with refrigerated cases. Dairy and frozen on the left, meat and deli on the right, produce up front near the entrance. Bakery tucked into a corner where the oven still ticked and cooled long after the day staff had gone home. The floor was a polished gray-white tile that reflected the fluorescence in soft, milky pools. The lights themselves were old. Not flickering, not failing, just old in that particular way commercial lights get, where they hum at a pitch you stop hearing after a while, but feel in your teeth. The first weeks were quiet. I learned the rhythm of overnight stocking. You break down a pallet, you scan the cases, you cut them open with a box cutter held a certain way, so you don't slice the products inside. You walk the aisle with a U-boat cart stacked with cans and boxes, and you face them. Facing is the word for pulling everything to the front of the shelf so the labels line up. It's strangely satisfying. You take a messy aisle and make it look like a magazine ad. You do that for 8 hours, and the time moves the way water moves, in long, slow pulls that don't feel like anything until you check the clock. Camille was the one who first told me about the moment, though she didn't call it that. Nobody on that crew called it anything. They had a way of referring to it without naming it, the way people in old houses talk around a draft. It was maybe my third week. I was on aisle 7, soup and canned vegetables, and Camille walked past, pushing an empty cart back toward the cooler. She slowed when she saw me, leaned on the cart handle and said, "You been keeping an eye on the clock?" I said, "Sure, the way you do when you don't really know what someone means." She smiled a little. She had one of those tired smiles that didn't reach her eyes anymore. Not because she was unfriendly, but because she'd used up that part of her face on other things. She said, "Don't worry about it yet. You'll feel it when you feel it. Just, when you do, don't make a big deal." I asked her what she meant. She thought about it for a second. Then she said, "There's a moment each night when no one moves. Not us. Not the store. Not anything. You'll know. Just stand still for it. It passes." And then she pushed her cart on toward dairy and left me holding a can of cream of mushroom soup, feeling vaguely like I'd missed a step on a staircase. I wrote it off. People who work overnight shifts get strange. The hours scrape something off you, and what's underneath gets eccentric. I figured Camille had her own little ritual, her own way of marking the hours, and that I'd hear about it eventually, the way you hear about everyone's quirks when you work close to them long enough. I was wrong about that, but only in the specifics. The first time I noticed it, I almost didn't notice it. That's the trick of it. It's designed, if designed is the word, to slip under your attention. It was a Tuesday, or technically a Wednesday, since it was about 3 in the morning. I was on aisle 12, pet food, and I had just slid a stack of cat food cases off the U-boat onto the floor. I straightened up, stretched my back, and looked down the aisle toward the front of the store. From there, you could see clear down to the registers, past the long rubber mat that ran the length of the floor. Lynn was at her station. I could see the top of her head, dark hair pulled back, leaning slightly on her elbows the way she did when no customers were in. And she wasn't moving. That's not unusual. People don't move all the time. They pause. They read their phones. They stare into the middle distance during a slow shift. But there was something about the quality of her stillness that caught me. It wasn't relaxed. It wasn't bored. It was complete, in a way that human stillness usually isn't. Even when we're sitting still, we breathe, we shift, we adjust our weight without thinking. Lynn wasn't doing any of that. I stood there with a box cutter in my hand and watched her for what couldn't have been more than a few seconds, but felt longer. The fluorescents hummed. The freezer cases hummed. Somewhere in the back, the bakery oven ticked. Then she moved. Just a small thing. She lifted one hand and brushed a piece of hair behind her ear. The spell, if it was a spell, broke. The store was full of small motions again. The flag on the front door display swayed faintly in the air conditioning. A bag of dog food settled with a soft crinkle in the cart beside me. Somewhere I could hear Camille's footsteps on the tile. I went back to stocking and tried to forget about it. I didn't say anything to Camille that night. I didn't say anything to anyone. I told myself I'd been zoning out, the way you do at 3 in the morning, and I'd just happened to look at Lynn during a long pause in her own zoning out. That was the rational explanation, and I was big on rational explanations back then. But the next night, I caught myself watching the clock. That's the first thing it does, I think. It teaches you to watch the clock without telling you why. For the next week or so, I noticed something I couldn't quite name. A kind of suspended feeling that came in sometime between 3 and 3:30 in the morning. It didn't happen at the same minute every night. I checked. I tried to time it. Some nights, it seemed to drift in around 3:11. Other nights, 3:22. Once, 3:04. What I started to call it, privately, was the dip. That's the closest word I had for it. The way the air in the store would dip, like a held breath. The way the sounds didn't stop exactly, but they thinned out. The freezer cases still hummed, but the hum sounded farther away. The fluorescent still buzzed, but the buzz didn't reach the floor the way it usually did. And in those seconds, when I looked up, I would see whoever was nearest to me holding still. Russell, on his knees in produce, sorting through a crate of apples, his hands resting flat on the green plastic for a beat too long. Camille, halfway down the frozen aisle, mid-step, her weight balanced on her front foot, the cart parked behind her at a slight angle. Lynn, at the register, looking down at the conveyor belt as though she were reading something off it. And the thing was, after the dip, they would all keep moving like nothing had happened. Russell would pick up an apple. Camille would set her foot down. Lynn would scratch her wrist or roll her shoulders. The store would unthin, and nobody, not one of them, would ever say a word about it. Now I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make this sound dramatic. And it wasn't. Not at first. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was so gentle, it was almost tender. If you've ever been in a room when a song ends, and there's that half second before the next one starts, where everyone is suspended in the absence. That's the closest comparison I can give. The dip felt like that, like a pause built into the night itself. I started to enjoy it, in a way. That sounds wrong, but it's true. There was something restful about it. After a while, I'd find myself looking forward to it. I'd be facing canned goods at 3 a.m, my feet aching, my back stiff, and I'd feel the air begin to soften, and I'd think, here it comes, and I'd let myself stop. I'd hold whatever I was holding. I'd stand there in the middle of the empty aisle while the lights hummed around me, and I'd let the moment pass through me like a slow wave, and then I'd go back to work. I told myself it was a meditation thing, a built-in micro-break that the body of the store, in some way I didn't understand, had taught itself to take. I told myself a lot of things in those weeks. The first crack in that story came on a Thursday in early summer. I was in the back, in the receiving area, breaking down empty cardboard boxes for the baler. The baler was a big green machine in the corner of the dock, the kind that compresses cardboard into tight bales tied off with wire. It was loud when it ran, but I wasn't running it then. I was just stacking flats. The dock door was rolled down. The fluorescents back there were dimmer than the floor lights, more yellow, and they cast everything in a kind of old photograph color. I felt the dip coming. I'd gotten good at feeling it by then. I set down the cardboard. I stood with my hands at my sides. I waited. But this time, instead of just letting it wash over me, I did something I hadn't done before. I turned my head, slowly, carefully, and I looked through the swinging doors that led from the back room out onto the sales floor. From where I was standing, I could see down the long center aisle of the store, the bread aisle, past the racks of hamburger buns and white loaves, all the way to the front, where the registers glowed under their own little island of light. Lynn was there, not moving. But she wasn't alone. There was a man at her register. I hadn't heard the door chime. I always heard the door chime. It was a small electronic ding that played whenever the sliding doors opened, and at 3 a.m, in a quiet store, it carried. I would have heard it even from the back, but I hadn't. The man was tall and thin. He was wearing a long coat, the kind people wore in the 90s, gray or tan. I couldn't tell from that distance. He had a basket on the conveyor belt. He was standing very straight, with his hands at his sides, and he was facing Lynn, and Lynn was facing him. Neither of them was moving, not in the held breath way I'd gotten used to, in a deeper way, as if the air between them had thickened and held them in place. I watched. I don't know for how long. Time did something strange in those seconds. I remember thinking very clearly that I should not move either. that whatever was happening up there at the register was a thing I was witnessing, not a thing I was part of, and that the rule was simple: don't be part of it. Then the dip ended. Lynn moved first. She picked up an item from the basket and ran it across the scanner. The scanner beeped. The man set a hand on the edge of the counter. He nodded. The store sounds came back: the freezer hum, the fluorescent buzz, the soft tick of the bakery oven. I could hear Camille humming faintly somewhere in the dairy aisle. I stood in the back room with a flat of cardboard at my feet and felt, for the first time, that I had been let in on something I should not have looked at directly. I went back out onto the floor a few minutes later, after I'd told myself I was being stupid. By then, the man was gone. The conveyor belt was empty. Lynn was sitting on her stool, looking at her phone, the way she always did between customers. I walked up to the front, casual, and asked her if it had been busy. She looked up at me. She had a way of looking at people that made you feel younger than you were. She said, "Same as always." I asked, trying to keep my voice light, if a guy in a long coat had just been in. She didn't answer right away. She didn't look surprised either. She just looked at me evenly, for a second longer than felt comfortable. Then she said, "Wes, don't ask about the customers who come in during the moment." I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. I tried to laugh, and the laugh didn't quite land. I said, "What customers?" She turned her stool slightly, away from me, back toward the register screen. She said, "That's the right answer. Keep saying it." And that was the end of that conversation. I want to step back here, because I think this is the part where, if you'd told me this story, I would have said, just quit. Just walk out. Why would anyone keep working there? And the honest answer is that I needed the money. That's the boring truth that horror stories tend to skip over. I had rent. I had a car payment on a Civic with 190,000 miles on it. I had a sister downstate who sometimes called me crying about her own bills, and I sometimes sent her what I could spare. I had a checking account that, if I left this job, would empty in about 3 weeks. And there was something else, too. Something I'm less proud of. I was curious, not in a brave way, in a low, persistent way, like a tongue going back to a sore tooth. I wanted to know what the moment was. I wanted to know who came in during it. I wanted to know why the people I worked with had built their lives around something they wouldn't name. So I stayed, and I started paying attention. The next thing I noticed was that the moment wasn't always the same length. Most nights, it was short, a breath. Maybe 3 or 4 seconds if you tried to count. Though counting felt wrong, like you were trying to measure something that didn't want to be measured. But some nights, it stretched. I'd feel the air thin and then keep thinning, and the hum of the freezers would get farther and farther away, and I'd stand there in the aisle with my hands open and feel a kind of pressure on my chest, like I was at the bottom of a swimming pool and hadn't realized how deep I'd gone. On those nights, when it finally ended, I would always look up toward the registers. And on those nights, there was always someone at Lynn's counter. Sometimes a man, sometimes a woman, once a child, holding the hand of someone I couldn't quite see, even though my eyes were on them. The child had on a yellow rain jacket, the bright kind. I remember that. I remember also that when the moment ended and the store sounds came back, the child was gone, and the conveyor belt had a single can of soup on it that hadn't been there before, and Lynn was scanning it like nothing had happened. I started keeping a notebook, a small one, the kind you can fit in the back pocket of your jeans. I wrote down dates. I wrote down approximate times. I wrote down what I'd been doing when the moment hit, and where I'd been standing, and whether it had been a short one or a long one. I wrote down what I saw at the registers, When I let myself look, I didn't show anyone the notebook. I didn't talk about it. But the act of writing things down made me feel like I had some kind of grip on it, like I was a witness to my own life again, instead of just floating through it. Russell was the first one to figure out I was paying attention. Russell was an older man. I'd guess late 60s. He'd been working at the store for, by his own count, 23 years. He had the produce section so thoroughly memorized that he didn't really need to look at what he was doing. His hands moved on their own. He'd talk to you while sorting tomatoes by ripeness with a precision that no algorithm could touch. One morning, around 4:30, when the shift had a kind of late-stretch tiredness to it, he came up behind me in the cereal aisle with a cup of bad coffee from the break room. He set the cup on top of a case of cornflakes I was opening. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there. Then he said, "You've been counting." I looked at him. He had the kind of face that didn't give much away. Steady eyes behind reading glasses, a salt and pepper mustache, lines around his mouth from a lifetime of small smiles. I said, "Counting what?" He said, "The moment. You've been keeping track. I can tell." I didn't bother lying. I said, "I've been writing things down." He nodded, slowly, like that was the answer he'd expected. He took a sip of his coffee. Then he said, "Stop." I asked him why. He looked down the aisle, looked back at me. He said, "Because if you keep counting, it starts counting back." I waited for him to explain. He didn't. He picked up his coffee, patted the case of cornflakes once, and walked off toward produce. I stood there with a box cutter in one hand and a plastic wrap tray of cereal in the other, and felt, for the second time, that I'd been told something I should have already known. I didn't stop. I want to say I did. I want to say I had the sense to listen to him. But I didn't. I kept the notebook. I kept writing. I told myself Russell was superstitious. I told myself everyone on that crew was a little broken in their own way, and that I didn't have to break the same way to do the job. For a while, nothing happened. The moment kept coming. The customers kept appearing. I kept my eyes mostly down, and I kept my notes mostly accurate. And the summer wore on into a wet, heavy August that turned the parking lot into a sheet of black mirror every night. Then, at the end of August, the moment found me. I want to tell you exactly how it happened, because the details matter. It was a Sunday night, or Monday morning. The store was empty. I was on aisle 9, baking goods, restocking flour and sugar. The bags were heavy and the work was slow. I had my back to the front of the store. I was kneeling, sliding a 5-pound bag of flour onto the bottom shelf, and I felt the dip start. It was a long one. I knew that right away. The air thinned all at once, the way it sometimes does in the mountains when you climb too fast. The freezer hum receded. The fluorescent buzz dropped 2 notches. I stayed on my knees. I set the flour down carefully. I closed my eyes for a second, the way I'd taken to doing, because it made the moment easier to ride out. When I opened them, I was looking at a pair of shoes. They were brown leather, old-fashioned, slightly cracked at the toes. They were standing about 3 feet from me in the middle of aisle 9, where, a heartbeat ago, there had been nothing. I didn't look up. I want to be clear about that. Some part of me, some old part that lives below thinking, knew not to look up. I kept my eyes on the shoes. I kept my hands on the bag of flour. I didn't breathe. The shoes were not moving. Of course they weren't. Nothing moved during the moment. That was the whole point. But there was a difference between not moving in the way Lynn didn't move, the way Russell didn't move, the way the bag of dog food on the cart didn't move, and not moving in the way these shoes weren't moving. The shoes were not moving the way a held breath isn't moving. They were not moving the way a finger pressed against a cut isn't moving. They were waiting. Time did the strange thing again, stretched. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and far away, like it was happening to someone in the next room. I could hear, very faintly, what sounded like a long exhale, though I don't know whose. And then the dip ended. The freezer hum came back. The fluorescent buzz came back. The store breathed. The shoes were gone. I stayed on my knees for a long time after that. Long enough that Camille came down the aisle looking for me. She found me there, with my hand still on the bag of flour, and she didn't ask what was wrong. She just crouched down next to me, her knees popping, and put a hand on my shoulder. She said, very quietly, "Did it stop in front of you?" I nodded. She said, "Did you look at it?" I shook my head. She let out a breath. She said, "Good. Okay. Good. Stand up. Slowly. We're going to go to the break room, and you're going to sit down, and you're going to drink some water, and you're not going to look at the registers for the rest of your shift. You understand?" I nodded again. She helped me up. We walked, slowly, to the back. Russell met us at the swinging doors. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Camille, and Camille gave him a small nod, and he gave her a smaller one back. It was the kind of communication that comes out of people who have been through the same thing too many times to need words for it. In the break room, with a paper cup of water in my hand and the hum of the soda machine in my ears, Camille finally talked to me about it. She told me what she knew, which she said wasn't much. She said the moment had been there as long as anyone she'd ever talked to could remember. She said it didn't only happen in this store. She said other people in other places had felt it, but most of them hadn't recognized it for what it was. She said it liked places that were open all night. It liked places where people moved in patterns. Hospitals, airports, 24-hour gas stations, rest stops, late-shift factories. Anywhere people were awake when they shouldn't be, doing repetitive things in bright light. She said the moment wasn't dangerous exactly. Not the way a fire was dangerous, or a stranger with a knife was dangerous. She said it was something more like weather. You didn't fight weather. You learned how to dress for it. The customers, she said, were the part nobody understood. They came in during the moment. They had business at the register. Lynn had been doing this job for 9 years, and she'd worked out over time that if she just rang them up and gave them what they brought to the counter, the moment would end, and everything would go back to normal. If she didn't, it wouldn't. I asked her what they bought. Camille looked at her water cup. She said, "You know, things from the store." I asked her what they paid with. She said, "I don't know. I asked Lynn once. She said she doesn't look. She just hits the cash button on the register, and the drawer opens, and there's the right amount of money in it. Every time." I asked her, finally, the question I'd been afraid to ask. I said, "What happens if they don't get what they came for?" Camille was quiet for a long time. She turned her water cup in a slow circle on the table. Outside the break room, the store hummed. She said, "There used to be 5 of us on this shift." I waited. She said, "His name was Aaron. He worked here for about a year. He was a nice kid, about your age. He started keeping track, like you've been doing. I don't know if you've been keeping track, but I figured. We all figured. Russell mentioned it." I didn't say anything. She said, "Aaron got curious. He wanted to know what they were. The customers. He started looking at them, watching them, during the moment. Doyle had warned him. We all had. He didn't listen." She took a sip of her water. She said, one night, he didn't come back from the floor. We looked for him. His apron was on aisle 6, folded up neat. His box cutter was on top of it. His phone was still in his pocket, but the apron was off. We never figured out how it got folded like that. I asked if anyone had called the police. She said, "Doyle did. They came. They took a report. They watched the security tapes, what there was of them. The tapes didn't show anything. I mean that literally. The tapes didn't show Aaron at all that night. Not coming in, not punching in, not on the floor. Just us. Just the four of us, working around a space where he should have been. She looked at me then. Right at me. She said, "I'm telling you this because I don't want to fold up your apron on aisle 6. I'm tired, Wes. I've been tired for a long time. So please, stop counting, stop watching, do your job, let the moment pass. That's all you have to do." I told her I would. I meant it too. Sitting in that break room, with my hands shaking around the paper cup, I meant it more than I'd ever meant anything in my life. For 2 weeks, I kept my word. I closed the notebook. I shoved it in the back of a drawer at home, under a stack of old utility bills, and I tried to forget it existed. At work, when the dip came, I closed my eyes and waited. I didn't look at the registers. I didn't look down the aisles. I didn't look at my own feet. I just stood there and let the moment pass. It got easier, in some ways. The not looking became its own kind of routine. I'd feel the air thin, and I'd lower my eyes, and I'd let my hands rest wherever they were, and I'd count my own slow breaths, except I wasn't really counting. I was just feeling them, in and out until the freezer hum came back. In other ways, it got harder, because once you know something is there, you can't unknow it. And there's a particular kind of strain that comes from spending 8 hours a night actively not paying attention to a thing. It's like driving for hours with a wasp in the car. You can pretend it's not there. You can keep your hands on the wheel. But you know, the thing that broke me wasn't curiosity. In the end, it was something smaller and more human and harder to forgive myself for. It was a name on the schedule. Doyle posted the next month's schedule on the corkboard in the break room on the 1st of every month. It was a printed grid with everyone's shifts laid out. I usually didn't look at it carefully. My schedule was the same every week, Sunday through Thursday, 10 to 6. But that month, in early September, I was making a cup of coffee in the break room, and I happened to glance over at the board. And there, on the schedule, on a Wednesday 2 weeks out, in the slot that said overnight grocery, was a name I didn't recognize. Aaron M. I stared at it. I set my coffee down. I walked over to the board and touched the paper, like that would tell me something. I read the rest of the schedule, line by line. My name was there. Camille's, Russell's, Lynn's, and under mine, on certain nights, in a smaller font, there was a second name, Aaron M. He was scheduled alongside me on 3 nights that month. I didn't ask Doyle about it. Doyle worked days. He left the schedule and the paperwork and the orders to the morning crew, and he came in occasionally to check on things, but he avoided the overnight shift the way some people avoid hospitals. I thought, even then, that he probably knew exactly why. I asked Camille. She was on break, sitting at the little table in the corner of the room, eating a cup of yogurt with a plastic spoon. I pointed at the schedule. I said, "Who's Aaron M.?" She looked up. She looked at the board. She looked back at her yogurt. She said, "Don't worry about it." I said, "Camille, the Aaron you told me about, is that the same Aaron?" She didn't answer for a long moment. Then she said, "Doyle puts him on the schedule sometimes. I don't know why. We never see him. He never punches in. The hours just get filled in by themselves at the end of the pay period." I said, "By themselves?" She said, "I don't know. I don't ask." I sat down across from her. I said, "Why does Doyle keep putting him on?" She looked at me, and her face had something in it that I hadn't seen there before. Not fear, exactly. Something older than fear. Something more like grief that has gone smooth from being carried. She said, I don't know if Doyle puts him on. I think the schedule does. I think the schedule remembers him. I went back to the floor that night with Aaron M.'s name in my head, and I worked my shift, and I let the moment pass without looking, and when I clocked out at 6 in the morning, I sat in the parking lot in my Civic for a long time with the engine off. I want to try to explain what happened to me in that car, because it's important. It's the closest I came to leaving. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, and I watched the sky get gray over the trees behind the store. I thought about my rent. I thought about my sister. I thought about the way Camille had looked at me when she said the schedule remembers him. I thought about Aaron, whoever he had been, with his apron folded neatly on aisle 6. I thought about how, somewhere in the company's payroll system, hours were being logged in his name. Being paid out, maybe. To whom, I had no idea. And I thought about the moment. About the way it felt to stand in the middle of aisle 12 at 3 in the morning and feel the air go soft. About how, in some honest part of me, I still looked forward to it. About the strange tenderness of it. About the way, when I let myself stop and let it pass, I felt more rested than I'd felt in years. I thought very clearly that this was how it got you. Not with terror, with comfort. I should have driven home and packed a bag. I should have called the temp agency I'd used before. I should have done a lot of things. What I did was start the car and go home and sleep for 10 hours. And when I woke up, I went back to work that night. Things changed after that. They changed in a way I didn't notice all at once. I want to lay them out the way they came. The first change was that the moment got longer. Before, I'd estimated most of them at 3 or 4 seconds. The long ones, maybe 10 or 15. After Aaron's name appeared on the schedule, the average crept up. I'd feel the dip start, and I'd close my eyes, and I'd count my breaths, and the count would get to 4, 5, 6 full breaths before the freezer hum came back. Then 7, then 8. The second change was that I started feeling other people's stillness. It's hard to explain. I'd be standing on aisle 9, eyes closed, in the middle of the moment, and I would somehow know, with a clarity I hadn't had before, that Camille was holding still in the dairy case section, that Russell was holding still in produce, his hand on a head of lettuce, that Lynn was holding still at the register, her eyes on the conveyor belt, that the customer at her counter was holding still too. I could feel them, the way you can feel someone watching you in a quiet room. And I could feel something else. Someone else. He stood, always, on aisle 6. I never opened my eyes during the moment. I want to be very clear about that. I never looked at him. But I knew exactly where he was. I could feel him in the way you can feel a person standing behind you in an elevator, not menacing, just present, just there, on aisle 6, not moving. The third change was the schedule. Aaron M.'s name started appearing more often. Where he'd been on the schedule 3 nights a month, he was on 5, then 7, then most of mine. I'd come into work and check the corkboard, the way you check the weather, and his name would be slotted under mine, in that smaller font, like an understudy. The fourth change was the hardest to admit. I started talking to him. Not out loud, not directly, but in my head, on the long nights, in the quiet of an empty aisle. I'd find myself thinking thoughts that were a little too specific to be just my own. I'd be facing canned tomatoes, and I'd think, you used to face these the same way. I'd be cutting open a case of paper towels, and I'd think, you held the box cutter wrong at first. They had to teach you. I told myself I was just imagining things. I told myself a lot of things. By that point, I told myself, had become a kind of background hum, like the freezers, like the fluorescence, like the moment. The night it all came to a head was a Thursday in late September, the first real cold night of the fall. The parking lot had a thin film of frost on it when I clocked in. The leaves on the few scrappy trees behind the store had started to go yellow. Inside, the produce section smelled like wet cardboard and pumpkin, because Russell had started bringing out the seasonal stock. I was on aisle 6. I want you to understand that I had been avoiding aisle 6 for weeks. It wasn't a hard thing to do. The store had 18 aisles. There was always something to stock somewhere else. I could rotate my work, and I had been carefully like a man stepping around a sleeping dog. But that night, Doyle had left a note on my U-boat. Not a real note. A pink slip from a pad with a line of his crooked handwriting. It said, "Paper goods need facing aisle 6 before morning. Customer complaint." I almost laughed when I read it. The idea that there had been a customer complaint at 3 in the morning was so absurd that for a second I wondered if Doyle was in on it, if he knew, if he was, in his own quiet daytime way, part of the same long-running thing. I went to aisle 6. It was paper goods. Toilet paper, paper towels, napkins, plates. Big light bags that took up a lot of shelf space and not much weight. Easy work. I started at the far end, near the back of the store, and worked my way toward the front, pulling each package to the edge of the shelf, lining up the labels so they all faced the same way, the way I'd been trained. The moment came at 3:14. I checked, after. It came on slow this time, slower than usual. The air didn't thin all at once. It eased, the way a song eases into a fade. The freezer hum dropped a notch. Then another. The fluorescence went from a buzz to a whisper. My own breathing got loud in my ears. I closed my eyes. I lowered my chin. I let my hands rest on the package of paper towels in front of me. And I felt him there. Not at the other end of the aisle, the way I usually did. Not at a polite distance, the way a stranger keeps from another stranger. He was close. 2 feet away, maybe, standing on my left. I could feel the shape of him in the air, the height, the thinness, the slight forward lean of someone who was used to standing in front of a U-boat for hours. I could feel his breath, or what passed for breath, in a slow rhythm that was very close to mine. Not quite mine. A half step off. The way 2 metronomes wound at slightly different speeds will drift in and out of sync. And in my head, very gently, I heard a voice that was not exactly a voice. It was more like the memory of one. A young man's voice, a little hoarse from a cold that hadn't quite cleared. Tired. It said, "You can stop now if you want." I didn't move. I didn't open my eyes. It said, "I can take it from here. You've been doing it a long time." I felt the strangest thing then. I felt my own tiredness, all of it, all the way down. The 8-hour shifts, the years before this job, the years before that, the bills, my sister's voice on the phone, the Civic with 190,000 miles, the cold in the apartment in winter when the heat didn't quite reach the bedroom, the slow accumulation of late nights and bad coffee and gray mornings. I felt how easy it would be to set it down. He wasn't lying. That's the part I want you to understand. He wasn't trying to trick me. He was offering, like one tired man, offering to take the next leg of a long drive while the other one slept. I thought about Aaron's apron, folded neatly on aisle 6. I understood, finally, what folded neatly meant. It didn't mean a struggle. It didn't mean anything violent. It meant exactly what it looked like. A man, very tired, taking off his apron at the end of a shift, setting his box cutter on top of it, stepping out of the roll, and someone, or something, stepping into it. I almost said yes. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's the most important thing I have to tell you about that night. Not what I saw. Not what I heard. What I almost did. I stood on aisle 6 with my eyes closed, and the moment stretched out around me like a held note, and I almost said yes. What stopped me wasn't bravery. It wasn't some flash of insight. It was something small and stupid and human. I thought of my sister. I thought of the last time she'd called me, a Tuesday afternoon, crying about a bill, and how I'd made a joke about it because I didn't know what else to do. And she'd laughed, this surprised, wet laugh, and we'd talked for another 20 minutes about nothing, about a show she'd been watching, about a guy at her work who'd brought in too many donuts. I thought about how, if I said yes, she would call my phone next Tuesday, and someone, or something, would answer. I opened my mouth, in my head, and I said, "No, thank you. Not yet." The presence on my left didn't react, didn't move away, didn't move closer, just stayed there, with its half-step-off breathing, in the long quiet of the moment. And then the moment ended. The freezer hum came back. The fluorescents went up to their usual buzz. The store breathed. I opened my eyes. There was no one on aisle 6 but me. I stood there for a long time. My hands were shakings. There was a package of paper towels in my grip that I'd squeezed so hard the plastic had a permanent dent in it. I set it down. I straightened it. I lined up the label. Then I walked, slowly, to the break room. I took off my apron. I folded it. I set my box cutter on top of it. I left them on the table. I want you to understand that I was very calm when I did this. I wasn't running. I wasn't panicking. I was making a decision, slowly and clearly, the way I should have made it a long time before. I clocked out at 3:31 in the morning. I told Camille, who was in the break room with her yogurt, that I was leaving. She looked at the apron on the table. She looked at me. She looked back at the apron. She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yeah, I'm sure." She nodded, slowly. She didn't try to talk me out of it. I think, on some level, she was glad. I think she'd been carrying the worry of me on top of everything else, and it was a relief, in a small way, to set me down. She said, "He'll keep your spot." I knew who she meant. I said, "Let him." She gave me a small, tired smile. She said, "Drive safe." I drove home. I packed a bag the next day. I gave notice on my apartment. I called my sister and told her I was moving back downstate for a while, that I'd had enough of Ohio winters. She didn't ask too many questions. We never asked each other too many questions. That was one of the better things about us. Within 2 weeks, I was gone. I'd like to tell you that was the end of it, that I drove south on I-71 with the windows down and felt the moment let go of me, the way a current lets go of a swimmer at the edge of a river. It wasn't the end. I want to tell you the rest of it carefully, because this is the part that took me a long time to understand. In the new town, I got a job at a hardware store. Daytime hours. Bright morning light through big plate glass windows. People came in to buy nails and sandpaper and paint rollers, and they made small talk. And at 5:30 I locked the front doors and went home and slept like a normal person. For a few months, I thought I'd outrun it. Then, one night in December, around 3 in the morning, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. I was lying on my back in my bed, in my new apartment, in a town 150 miles from the grocery store on Linden, and I was awake. My eyes were open in the dark. The room was quiet. The heater clicked. The air was thin. I knew it before I knew it. The freezer hum of the world had dropped a notch. The buzz of the streetlight outside my window had thinned. The whole night had taken a small step away from me. I lay there. I closed my eyes. I let my hands rest on the blanket. I waited. It passed. Maybe 4 seconds. Maybe 5. The heater clicked again. The streetlight buzzed. The world came back. I didn't get up. I didn't turn on the light. I lay there in the dark and understood something I had been avoiding understanding for a long time. The moment wasn't a thing in the grocery store. The grocery store was a place where the moment was loud enough to notice. That was all. The moment was everywhere. It always had been. It happened every night, in every town, in every city, in hospital corridors and airport gates and gas stations and kitchens and bedrooms. There was a second, somewhere between 3 and 3:30 in the morning, when the world held still. Most people slept through it. Most people who were awake didn't have the kind of attention it took to feel it. But once you'd felt it, you would feel it for the rest of your life. I get it now, every night. Sometimes I'm asleep. Sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I'm in bed. Sometimes I'm at the kitchen sink, getting a glass of water. Once, I was driving home from a friend's house, on a stretch of empty 2-lane road, and I felt the air thin, and I took my foot off the gas and let the car coast in neutral until it passed. I don't look. That's the rule I've kept. I don't look toward whatever might be standing nearby. I don't look at my own hands. I don't look out the window. I just close my eyes, or lower them, and I let it pass. And here's the thing I haven't told anyone until now. I don't always feel alone, in the moment. Sometimes, when I'm holding still, I can feel a presence a half step off from my own breathing. Not close, the way it was on aisle 6. Distant, like someone standing at the other end of a long room. Familiar, patient. I think it's him. I think it's the thing that called itself Aaron, or wore his name. I think it's still working a shift somewhere, in a brightly lit aisle, in a building I'll never see again, and that on the other end of every moment, it's standing very still beside a U-boat cart, and remembering that it offered me a chance to set my apron down, and that I said no. I don't know if it's waiting for me to change my mind. I don't know if it has to wait. I don't know how long, in its way of counting, an offer like that stays open. What I do know is this. There's a moment each night when no one moves. It happens around 3. It lasts a few seconds. Most people will never feel it. If you're listening to this, and your eyes are getting heavy, and the room around you has gone quiet in that particular way that rooms get late at night, you might be close to it. You might already be in it. You might have just come out of one without realizing. If you ever do feel it, the way I felt it, the way Camille and Russell and Lynn felt it, the way Aaron felt it before he folded his apron, I'll tell you what I wish someone had told me on my first night. Don't count. Don't watch. Don't look toward whoever is standing near you. Don't answer if a voice that isn't quite a voice offers, very gently, to take it from here. Just close your eyes. Let your hands rest. Breathe through it. It will pass. It always passes. And in the morning, when the light comes back, and the heater clicks on, and the world starts moving again, get up. Make your coffee. Call the people you love. Go to work, whatever your work is. Live the small, ordinary day you've been given. That's the part the moment can't have. That's the part that's still yours. That's the part I'm trying every day to keep.